My name is Anne, and I'm here to tell you why I think self-driving cars are going to be part of all of our world by 2020. In 2013, I started working at Google's self-driving car program. At that point, Google's project was more or less the industry. But today, everyone and their TechCrunch reading uncle is investing in and talking about self-driving cars. We must be seeing the dawn, the birth of a new age, a new era in technology, right? Actually, people have been promising self-driving cars since before World War II. In 1940, Norman Geddes wrote, "These cars of 1960, and the highways on which they will drive will have in them devices which will correct the faults of human drivers. They'll prevent the driver from committing errors." He goes on to talk about how these incredible cars will ferry people across mountains and throughout city streets. Norman wasn't a science fiction author. In fact, he consulted for GM and was one of the foremost respected industrial designers of his era. And he wasn't the only early arrival to the self-driving cars party. In fact, throughout the 60s, 70s, and 80s, the US government, MIT, Berkeley, and countless other institutions promised self-driving cars would be arriving soon. So, are self-driving cars actually around the corner this time? Or are we doomed to the over-optimism of the past? Lucky for us, this time really is different. Oops, I'm missing a slide, sorry. When I started working at Google in 2013, I was making strategic plans and forecasts that involved self-driving in a forecastable future. I had trouble believing that. I couldn't believe that, no one else was touching self-driving, and here we were forecasting a business around it. But in my 3.5 years there, I came to realize something really important. Thanks to sustained R&D and investment from the government, academia, Google, and others, we've recently made fundamental advances in the tech that allows self-driving to be possible. Finally, today, there are no technical roadblocks standing between us and a truly self-driving future. Someday soon, maybe 2020 for some of us, maybe 2030 for those of us who insist in living in snowy, chaotic places like New York, we'll all get a chance to experience exactly what Norman promised in 1940. To understand how we got to this point, it helps understand a little bit about how self-driving cars actually work. And to do that, it helps understand how we as humans actually drive. This is Market Street in downtown San Francisco. It has buses, pedestrians, crazy bicyclists, texting drivers, all types of really crazy complex chaos. And we as humans are surprisingly good at dealing with this. You can think about our driving in kind of 3 basic steps. First, we see the world. We perceive the environment around us and respond and use our ears and eyes to kind of create perceptions. Next, we understand. Using these perceptions that we've created, we create mental models and predict how things might evolve. Finally, we act. We take these mental models and decide whether to press the accelerator or slam on the brakes to avoid that crazy bicyclist. Cars must go through these same 3 steps. Sorry, I have a bit of a cold today. But until recently, it was nearly impossible for them to do any of these 3 things. And by understanding kind of this framework, we can understand why the optimism of the 60s, 70s, and 80s was misplaced. At that time, their cars couldn't see because cameras were underperforming and not very good. They definitely couldn't understand because computers existed in giant rooms in extremely expensive warehouses and universities. They were definitely not portable. And finally, they couldn't act. Cars were purely mechanical. There was no easy way for software to actually talk to the steering wheel or brakes that would allow a car to drive. We began to make some substantial progress on some of these factors in the 90s, 80s, and 90s. At that point, what you saw were powerful, portable personal computers. So, researchers at the time decided to take a few of these new supercomputers, stick them together, throw some cooling on them, and toss them in the back of a van. This actually led to some really cool advances in self-driving technology. In 1995, a team from Carnegie Mellon navigated from Pittsburgh to San Diego, with software doing the navigation 98% of the time. You can also see their extremely advanced 1990s graphic capabilities in the map that they created. Later that year, a German team managed to navigate 95% autonomously on the Autobahn. If you've ever been to Germany and driven on the Autobahn, you'll understand that this is quite the feat, especially for 1995. Again, as we talked about, you can see in the back of this van, that's basically all computing power. This is a computer with a steering wheel, more or less. So, great advances, but still cold, hard reality was the dominating factor. We had better cameras, but they still really couldn't perform. Computers were portable, but they really couldn't process enough information from the cameras to drive successfully on anything except for a very structured highway. And again, there was no easy interface to the vehicle. For both of those teams, the humans in the car actually had to either complete either the steering or the braking and acceleration for the car itself, because there was no electronic interface there. Enter DARPA, where cold, hard reality has never really been a constraint. DARPA is the military's R&D arm. They're responsible for all types of innovation. You may have heard of the internet. That came from DARPA. They did some early work in the early 2000s and decided that self-driving actually looked solvable with foreseeable technology. To speed the point at which we could get there, they resorted to an ancient stimulant of creativity, the multi-million-dollar prize. In 2004, they offered $1 million to any team that could navigate a remote desert course. 15 teams entered, and none even got anywhere near the finish line. But the next year, 195 teams entered, and 5 teams finished the course. You see the 3 winners here. Stanley on the left finished the course very quickly, and the 2 teams from Carnegie Mellon were right behind. In 2007, DARPA ran an urban version of the challenge. 53 teams entered, and 6 completed a course that required navigating lane changes, stop signs, and even other human drivers. This is BOSS, the team that won that challenge. These teams showed that we could make fundamental technological advantage or progress against the challenges of self-driving, but there were still substantial roadblocks in place, potentially, especially on the cost side. Those sensors on BOSS that we just saw cost more than a house in most parts of the country. Car makers saw this and decided to go focus on more achievable versions, achievable meaning cheaper, versions of semi-autonomy, like traffic jam assist and parking assist. Google saw this and saw an opportunity. They recruited top engineers from the DARPA teams and gave them a new challenge. Create a system that could drive 1,000 miles on California's most iconic highway routes, from 280 just to the west of us today, to Highway 1 south of Big Sur. That team completed the challenge in no time flat, and by 2013 was driving on surface streets. Suddenly, self-driving looked possible. To understand how we got to that point, let's return to Market Street. We do a pretty good job of driving with these 2 cameras in the front of our head and some pretty amazing post-processing on the back end in our brains. But cameras aren't as good as our eyes, and computers are nowhere near as efficient as our brains at processing visual information. So modern self-driving cars rely on multi-sensor arrays to get an accurate picture of the world around them. When a car drives today, its LiDAR creates point clouds that give you accurate representations of space and distance. Here's what a car might see when it's driving down something like Market Street. Its radar gives it the ability to see near-field navigation and helps triangulate distance that the LiDAR gives it. And cameras pick out fine details like traffic lights and stop signs. These components have all been available for a very long time, particularly radars and cameras. But until recently, they were extremely expensive. However, as self-driving has looked possible, investment has flown into the space and costs have come down substantially. In January, Waymo announced, that's Google's self-driving car project's new name, a 90% reduction in LiDAR costs. And Velodyne and others have announced targets of $250 on a part that 3 years ago cost $10,000. Today, we finally have cars that can see at a reasonable price point. But what about understanding all this incredible sensor data? In the past, computing hardware itself and software algorithms would not have been able to deal with all of these incredibly detailed sensor feeds. Lucky for us, there's been incredible innovation on the chip side as well as the software side. NVIDIA and Intel are delivering driving-specific chips that have driven down costs and improved performance. Deep learning and other machine learning techniques are running on terabytes of cloud training data and delivering computer vision and behavior prediction that could never have been predicted even 3 years ago. Let's look back at Market Street. After the car gets the sensor data back, its deep learning algorithm can recognize a bus and tell the car that, that's a bus. It's probably going to pull out with no regard for what's around it. Let's steer clear and be careful. It can see that bicyclist and say, oh, that's a turn signal for turning right. Let me make sure we give it enough space so she can turn right safely. Finally, cars today can actually understand and do it in a reasonably quick time frame. But what about acting? How do we actually get from all the seeing and understanding to actually driving? Well, most of the innovation that we've talked about so far happened outside the bounds of traditional auto manufacturers. Unfortunately, you can't really commercialize a self-driving car without their help. A robot can't really steer and can't really use the pedals. You need clean electrical interfaces between the driver, the computer, and the car itself. Thanks to the dedication of Waymo, Uber, and others in this space, car makers are beginning to take autonomy seriously, and they're beginning to collaborate with tech companies. What you're seeing if you've been around Mountain View recently are these incredible minivans that Waymo has been developing with Fiat Chrysler. If you were in San Francisco recently, you may have seen these SUVs from Uber. Finally, we're actually getting cars that are capable of interacting with a robot driver and giving us a self-driving experience on the road itself. All these innovations really needed to happen at the same time. We're extremely lucky to be here today. If we had sensors but no understanding, it'd basically be like putting an 8-year-old behind the wheel of the car. No one would invest in making those sensors cheap. If we had understanding but no good sensors, it'd be like throwing a driver behind the wheel, then putting a blindfold on them. Again, who would improve that software if the driver can't actually see what's going on around them? And finally, without this interlocking progress on the software and hardware side, car makers would never take autonomy seriously, and we would never actually get cars that could interact with a new virtual driver. Thanks to these interconnected technological advances, we're lucky enough to be witnessing the actual arrival of the self-driving car. Norman would be jealous. Self-driving cars are actually around the corner for us. I hope you're as excited as I am to get in the passenger seat.